Hello, everyone. Today, I want to talk about the big question that everyone asks outside of Germany about the Energiewende, but that is not really a big question within Germany because the Germans know the answer. And that is, why do we have a nuclear phase out in Germany, but not a coal phase out? It seems like a good question, but actually, if you understand that not everything is carbon dioxide, and if you include other questions and other priorities, you begin to get the answer pretty quickly. The pollution from coal power was kind of seen as the price you had to pay for economic growth. In fact, at the beginning of the 1960s, a prominent German politician named Willy Brandt, who would later become German Chancellor, actually spoke of wanting to have blue skies in the Ruhr area, which is a big industrial zone in Germany. And he was laughed at for that. Most people could not even imagine that you could have industrial growth and prosperity without the pollution from coal power. Coal was considered kind of inseparable from this economic growth since, I guess, the mid-1800s. In contrast, nuclear power came as this sudden intrusion. So you had nuclear power plants in the 1950s, the first ones that were built. And by the 1970s, the projects that were going to go up were bigger than the largest coal plants that the country had. And these nuclear reactors were then put in places that didn't have the coal power, that didn't have this infrastructure. So this was considered a sudden change. Nuclear at the time was a great hope that the Germans had and that most of the world had. People really wanted to have nuclear power as a clean technology to move away from coal. The problem is nuclear never delivered. With coal power, you knew that you got affordable electricity and pollution. With nuclear, what you got was a lot of hopes and aspirations, but you didn't get the actual reactors. Let's take a look at what this looks like globally, because this is not really just a problem in Germany. France now has about 58 reactors, but to get that 58, it actually had to have a target of 170 reactors by 2000. And this is basically forgotten today. We talk about the nuclear sector in France as this great success, but in terms of target attainment, they didn't do that well. And this happens all over the world. When nuclear got started in Europe, the Euratom idea was to have 15 gigawatts by the early 1970s, and that didn't work either. Germany at one point planned to have 45 reactors, but the country never had more than 19 at one time. It's perhaps a bit unfair to throw what Richard Nixon once said as President of the United States into the picture because it was never official policy, but just to show you how overrated and how high these over expectations were for nuclear. Nixon once said he wanted to have 1,000 reactors, and they actually never got more than around 100. And finally, this is not even restricted to the OECD countries. India has long had a target for nuclear that it cannot reach even today. If you take a look now at what's happening with wind power in India, you'll see that the country is very clearly able to ramp up wind power faster than it has been able to ramp up nuclear. The same thing is happening in Brazil, and here's the chart for that. And the same thing is also happening in China, and here's the chart for that. And again, this is not gigawatts that I'm showing you in these last three charts. This is actual kilowatt hours. So this is the amount of electricity that's being generated. Coal and nuclear, the companies began to sort of look at this and say, which one of these works better? And actually the utilities themselves and the engineering firms themselves kind of lost faith in nuclear over the decades, by the 1970s, in fact. When we talk about coal power and nuclear power, we often focus on the power plants. In fact, we need to talk about jobs. We need to talk about the coal mines and the uranium mines, because that's where a lot of the actual assets are, and that's where the unions are going to be organized. Germany doesn't have uranium resources, so it imports all of its uranium for its nuclear power plants. So guess what? You don't have a lot of people who can go out on the street here and protest in favor of nuclear. In contrast, Germany has the largest lignite reserves, brown coal reserves, in the world. When we think about it in those terms, you begin to understand that whenever there have been protests against coal power, and those have taken place, other people have actually gone out on the street and tried to counteract that by saying our jobs are at stake and our communities are at stake. In terms of, if we had built too much nuclear, we would have actually, these companies would have actually been sort of undercutting the value of the coal that they had in the ground. Nuclear simply didn't have enough friends in Germany, whereas the coal sector did. For instance, the municipal utilities in Germany, some of the smaller ones, they're able to have small and mid-sized coal facilities, but the nuclear plants got so big so soon that the only utilities that could build them were the big guys. But when you get these big corporations, everybody loves to hate big business, right? And so you had this small number of big companies that people like to dislike, and it was easy to corral them and say, these are the bad guys. And you could also then say that about nuclear power itself. Let's do a little experiment here. A power plant is going to be built next door to you. Now, you have a choice between two types of power plants, a coal plant that is going to work and a nuclear plant that is going to work. It's not going to melt down. Which one do you take? Now, if you ask the question that way, probably a lot of people would take the nuclear plant. Think about it. The coal plant is definitely going to be bad. The nuclear plant is going to be pretty good unless something goes wrong. And if you know it's not going to go wrong, then it's probably better than the coal plant. Sociologists explain that people basically don't like risks when there's going to be a sudden change, even if the likelihood of that risk is not very high. So it's not very likely that a nuclear plant is going to melt down, but if there is a big meltdown, there's going to be sudden change right away. And people tend, for various reasons, to prefer a lower level of inconvenience, of risk, of damage, of danger. We think of airplanes as really dangerous, and we prefer to take cars, whereas actually car crashes happen all the time, and airline travel is relatively safe. One big difference there is that people have a car crash and they survive it. In fact, I've had 2 car crashes and nobody even got hurt in either one of them. In the end, what we are asking Germany to do is, in a way, unprecedented. It has these large coal resources, and we're asking Germany to leave them in the ground. Now, other countries have left fossil resources in the ground. We can think of the UK under Thatcher. We can think of the US now transitioning from coal to shale gas. Both of those countries did that on an economic basis. There was an economic case for that. What we're asking Germany to do is leave a lot of this carbon in the ground when there's actually still an economic case to dig it up and burn it. Another example that we could throw in is Ontario, where they've also phased out coal, but again, they phased out the coal plants. They don't have the coal resources. They were importing that coal. And so there's not this kind of job impact and domestic energy impact. Finally, I'd like to point out that a coal phase out is going to come in Germany. It's no longer a question of whether, it's a question of when. And we will talk about that in some other videos. Think about what Germany is doing. They're transitioning to renewables, but it's mainly wind and solar, and that's electricity. And so we got this electricity to replace coal power with. What we don't have is something to replace oil with. So in the end, we need to not only think about, why does Germany have a nuclear phase out and not a coal phase out, but why doesn't Germany have an oil and gas phase out, and when is that going to come?